The other option you have for multi-protocol BGP is to have separate neighborships for your IPv4 address families and separate neighborships for your IPv6 address families. Here's an example of that. We have both an eBGP over IPv6 session established and an eBGP over IPv4 session established. And if you look down below, you can see that you have neighbor statements for both IPv4 and IPv6 addresses for the exact same neighbor. It's just IPv4 versus IPv6. And then down in the address family, you can see you're activating that particular neighbor based on their IPv4 or IPv6 address. What is this going to do for us? Well, one, increased resource usage, because now we have multiple sessions between the exact same neighbors for IPv4 and IPv6. The IPv4 traffic is going to be using the IPv4 sessions, and the IPv6 routes are going to be using the IPv6 session instead. So we're keeping everything separate at this particular point in time. And we're not going to run into that problem whereby we have to modify the next hop IP address when we send routes to our neighbors, because the session is a IPv6 session, so we will know the actual IPv6 next hop address now. So right now, R4 and ISPA have established their neighbor adjacency through IPv4. And if we look at the output of show BGP IPv6 unicast summary, we can see that the neighbor for IPv6 is an IPv4 address. So let's modify this behavior now. Let's have an IPv4 address family, and let's have an IPv6 address family, but in this case, IPv4 is going to use IPv4 TCP sessions. The IPv6 address family is going to use the IPv6 TCP sessions. Let's review the current configuration. Show run pipe to section router BGP. And what we'll need to do is we will need to remove this neighbor command that we see, or this neighbor activate command that we see underneath the address family for IPv6. Global configuration mode, router BGP 64500, address family IPv6, unicast, and we will remove this. So no neighbor. So this will break our neighborship that we have. Now, underneath the router BGP configuration mode, we're going to add a neighbor statement. And this neighbor statement is going to be for the IPv6 global unicast address of ISPA. And we're going to specify the remote autonomous system for that. So we're back in the main BGP configuration mode. We're going to type in neighbor, and it's 2001:A:/4:1, and they are in remote autonomous system 64503. Now we'll go back into IPv6 address family configuration mode. Address family IPv6, unicast, and we'll say neighbor, and in this case, it's this neighbor we're going to activate in this address family. So we got one end of the spectrum done here. ISPA still has to make their modifications. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the output of show BGP IPv6 unicast summary. And right now, you'll notice that we have a neighbor statement for 2001 AA:4:1 using BGP version 4. There's the autonomous system number. And we're idle right now. We're idle. We're sending out, right, the messages that are necessary to establish this TCP session, but ISPA does not have the configuration to point back to us and establish that neighborship. So let's go over to ISPA. Let's make the change there. Let's look at the show run pipe to section router BGP. And we'll notice underneath the address family for IPv6, we're going to have to remove these two neighbor statements. And underneath the main mode, we're going to have to add in a neighbor statement for the IPv6 address. So let's start off there. We're going to configure terminal. Router BGP 64503. We're going to have a neighbor, and that neighbor is who? 2001 colon A colon A colon 4 double colon 4. And they are in remote autonomous system 64,500. And then we'll go into address family IPv6 unicast configuration mode, and we'll say neighbor activate. And should establish a neighbor adjacency here shortly. There we go. I'm going to remove these two just to get them out of the way because they're not needed. So no and no. All right, so neighbor's not active. Therefore, it already removed that command for us, so I didn't need to remove it. Let's look at the output of our configuration now. So we have it completely separated out. A neighbor ship for both IPv4 and IPv6. Activated for, let's see here, IPv6. Activated for IPv4. This command's not necessary underneath that address family. Let's go ahead and, did R4 automatically create that as well? Yes, it did. So you can see how it automatically creates a no neighbor activate statement underneath the IPv4 address family as well, so you don't establish a neighborship underneath the IPv4 address family using IPv6 addresses. All right, so let's now look at the output of show BGP IPv6 unicast summary. There's the neighborship now being formed using the IPv6 address. We can see our prefixes learned are 2. And I want to look at the show BGP IPv6 unicast command, which is our BGP table. The next top IP address doesn't have to be modified. It's already the IPv6 address. And you can see these are the best. They're in the routing table. Show IPv6 route. And there they are listed right there.